Welcome back to the Gardening with Joy and Holly radio show. Moments away, author and radio host Doug Oster. But first, a message from Rise Gardens.
Rise Gardens is a revolutionary hydroponic gardening system for your home. Instead of food traveling hundreds or even over 1,000 miles before it hits your plate, harvest the veggies, herbs, and greens you need for dinner tonight in the comfort of your home. No green thumb required, knowledge. Gardening made easy with the Rise Gardens app. Step-by-step guidance from seed to harvest. A complete garden on a shelf and comes with everything you need to grow healthy and the freshest food for you and your loved ones. Fully customize your garden to your needs and preferences. For more information and get your Rise Garden, visit risegardens.com.
Holly, let's go to the hotline and bring in our guest for this week.
Doug Oster is the Pittsburgh garden guru. He's also an Emmy Award-winning producer, television host, and writer. He's the host of the Organic Gardeners radio show and an avid backyard gardener residing in Pittsburgh. Welcome to the program, Doug.
Thanks for having me. How are you guys doing?
We are doing well. We're excited that spring may be getting closer than it was, and we keep getting these potential snowfalls, but it's not going to last very long, so we're looking forward to it, as I'm sure you are too.
Yeah, I think we might be done with the snow, but we'll see. You never know.
We've had it up to in early May before, so
just hush.
So we talk about the importance of organic gardening. You were not always an organic gardener until you had an aha moment in the garden with your son. What was that moment, and how did that transition your thinking to organic gardening?
How do you remember that story? That's what I want to know. So my son, who's now 35, when he was a toddler, I had cabbage worms really bad. Again, I was gardening like my parents and grandparents had gardened. I didn't know any better, and I had called a friend, and I said, what do I do about cabbage worms? And he said, just go down to the hardware store, get this stuff called 7, and sprinkle it on. And I did that, and it killed those cabbage worms right away, and I was, overjoyed. But when I looked into the garden, I saw my young son walking barefoot through that stuff, searching for snow peas. That was my epiphany, and I was like, that can't be right. But I thought, well, how bad can this stuff be? I mean, I got it at the hardware store, and I started looking at the back of the package, and I was like, this is a nerve toxin, From that moment on, I just decided I was going to do it differently, and I had heard of something like newfangled called organic gardening, and at the time there was no internet. And I told this story the other day at our local home and garden show, and when I said that there was no internet, a kid that was sitting in the audience actually gasped. And so I went to the library, read everything I could on organic gardening, and I found out it wasn't newfangled at all. In fact, everybody was an organic gardener before World War II because there were no chemical pesticides, herbicides, or fertilizers. And that really bolstered my confidence, because I was afraid that when I stopped using these chemicals that I would be overrun with pests and diseases, but it didn't work out that way. And I learned a different way to garden. When I applied that broad-spectrum pesticide on there, I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. I killed the bad bug, but at the time I didn't know to look at a bigger picture where I was killing all the good bugs and I was killing my soil life down below. And so that epiphany changed everything for me. And since that day, I've never used chemicals in the garden. And to tell you the truth, my garden kind of takes care of itself because I'm always working hard on the soil. And so I don't have that many problems. I don't even use many organic products in the garden, except maybe sometimes a biological fungicide, and that's rare.
Now, for people who may go down that road of organic gardening, but they see an infestation of a bad bug, let's say aphids or whiteflies, what would you suggest to get that back in check to where the nature can control it at that point, or what do you do?
Well, the number one thing in my organic system is compost and organic matter. Always, whenever I'm planting anything, I'm adding organic matter in the form of compost that I make, or it could be compost by the bag. It could be compost by the truckload. Here around the Pittsburgh area, they give away compost that the municipalities make out of our leaves, and it's great stuff. So by doing that, the first step is by improving that soil. The plants are getting everything they need from the compost. All I want to do is I want to dig my planting hole. I want to improve it with as much compost as I can, put the plant in, mulch it, water it, and let it do its thing. After that, we'll always have problems in the garden. And I answer questions all day long about especially aphids. When I see an infestation of aphids, that plant isn't happy. And so that's the first thing. But then for dealing with whatever the pest is, we specifically target that pest in a way that we're not going to disrupt the whole cycle of nature like I did when I threw that 7 down. And so there's specific things. So aphids, first thing, you blow them off the plant with a hose. It's really hard for them to get back up. If you have a real infestation, horticultural oil, insecticidal soap, things that are safe for us, safe for our families, and safe for people that live downstream. Same thing with the whiteflies. My tomatoes at the end of the season, when they get crowded, sometimes you'll start to see some whiteflies at the end of the season. No big deal. If it's early in the season, again, same sort of thing. Horticultural oil, insecticidal soap, but it's not just one application. You got to get it on the insect itself, which means under the leaves. And when we take these different steps, whatever they might be, whether it's a sucking insect like an aphid or a chewing insect like a Japanese beetle, when we take an action that is specifically targeted at them, we'll allow the good bugs to do what they do. And again, not using chemicals in the garden, the birds are eating things and it's not hurting them. The pollinators are happy and they are helping you garden. And so by doing this, we're just letting the good bugs and nature take its course and help us garden. That's the idea.
So kind of springing off the natural gardening, natural way of gardening, our listeners know that we encourage minimal soil disturbance and we don't till. You follow that same practice. What are your reasons for not tilling, and why do you encourage your listeners yourself not to till?
Well, it came from a book called Teaming with Microbes by Jeff Lowenfels. That was, again, another epiphany where, the theory being that this whole symbiotic network under the ground gets all torn up when you till, and it takes all season to come back together. And I was very suspect of this. I had been a tiller my whole gardening career. When you're taught to do something a certain way and you see how good a garden can be, you keep doing it. But I converted half my veggie garden to no-till. And in one season, the next season, it was like, this is the way I'm doing it. I like doing it this way. I'm not sure if it's any easier because, again, every time at the end of the season, I'm putting a couple inches of compost on. Then again in the spring, so I'm spending a lot of time, from where my driveway is to where my garden is about 800 yards. So it's a long run with that wheelbarrow. And I also, I encourage people to not to till, but I also tell them you don't have to feel bad if that's what you want to do. I always say that there's 100 different ways to do every gardening job, and if it works for you, then it's right. I don't want to be on a soapbox, and say this is the only way to do it. I find it a very wonderful and a great way to grow, and for me, it's the right thing. And I encourage people to no-till, but there's some people that just are never going to make that transition, and I don't want to make them feel guilty about that.
Right. What are your top 3 tips for people to save space in an urban setting? I know many of your listeners on your radio show and ours are in urban and very tight confinements. What do you suggest to maximize what they have available?
Well, the first thing would be what people have been telling me for 50 years. Grow up. And that means grow vertically. And I do a lot of that. Even though this is interesting how this would work both for small spaces, but I'm on 4 acres. I'm 7 miles north of Pittsburgh, and I'm on 4 acres, mostly wooded, with a 30 by 40 vegetable garden. I want to grow more stuff. And I think anybody does, no matter what kind of garden they're at. And that vertical growing really makes a big difference. when you take those vine crops or whatever it is, that anything that can climb, and move it up as opposed to letting it ramble. Secondly, of course, containers. But whenever I talk containers with people, I always say bigger is better. Containers, when you're in April, May, and you're getting lots of rain, you're thinking, boy, this was a great idea to have containers. In July, you're thinking, this was an awful idea to have containers,
right?
Because I've got to be out there watering every day. More mass means less watering. And so, depending on your space, the bigger container you can use, in my opinion, is going to be better for you. And then also looking for varieties that don't go crazy and grow huge. In the case of, if you're growing tomatoes, you have a very small space and you want to do them in containers, you need the big container because tomatoes, if they dry out, we all know this, they get blossom end rot. So you got to keep water on them. But something like a super bush that gives you a decent sized tomato but doesn't have the vines that will get 8 feet tall eventually. I think those three things for me for urban gardens. And then actually, can I go to a fourth thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Use your imagination in your space and look at it carefully and think, that wall would actually be a great place to put my peppers next to, because the sun hits that wall and heats it up, and I could put an actual kind of a big raised bed right behind there, and I could put a little thing on the side where I could sit, and I'd have 6 pepper plants in there, and they would go nuts there. So just use your imagination. And that's one of the things about gardening. It's supposed to be fun. And if it's not fun, you really have to look at it and say, do I need to scale back? Do I need to grow different things? I think we've all been through this, where I certainly have, where I've bitten off more than I can chew. And I've had to, in my landscape, I've had to let things go back to the woods. Let the woods take it over, and everything does what it can. And I'm so much happier because I've figured out my comfort zone where I can take care of this. And as I get older, I can do less and less, and I keep adding more and more benches to get from one place to the next in the garden. So I sit here for a little bit, and actually, as I get older, I spend more time thinking about what I want to do in the garden. I sit in those benches and I watch the chipmunks do their thing, or I listen to the fountain, and I ponder, much longer than I used to. When I was younger, I was just, let's go do it. Let's get to work, and we're going to make a new bed and this and that. I think about it more carefully, and I really do enjoy my time just sitting in the garden.
Fantastic. So we are often learning from our followers and listeners. What is something that you've learned maybe recently or just along the way that really stuck out to you? Maybe something you felt, this listener just told me about this, but I should have already known this, or just a random tip.
That's a good question. I guess for me, first off, many times it's varieties, whether it's a red envy daffodil, I'm a daffodil fanatic, or a different type of tomato. But I think the technique that I use the most now, that I learned from somebody I bumped into at the Home and Garden Show, is horizontal planting of tomatoes, something I never would have thought of. Again, you kind of get blinders on sometimes. I was taught to plant tomatoes a certain way. And when I learned the horizontal planting technique, where you have a decent-sized plant, you're stripping off the bottom leaves, you're just making a shallow trench, and you're just leaving the top of the plant as is, and gently putting into that little, spot there, and covering it with compost and mulch. And you have to know where your stake's going in, because if you pound that stake right through the stem, that's not going to be a good thing. But I find that having that stem in that little trench, that all becomes roots, and it's close to the heat, which it wants, and it's close to water. And when someone explains that to you, it's eye-opening. It's like, wow, that maybe I should have known that, but I never would have thought of that. And I use that technique a lot, especially I've got a little unheated greenhouse, and I'm in the woods. So the unheated greenhouse is like full sun right now, 80 degrees out there no matter what with the sun's out. But when those trees start to leaf out, my tomatoes start to get leggy, and that makes them perfect candidates for horizontal planting. And when you do that horizontal planting, you won't believe what your tomato will do, especially early on, because let's say you had that long stem and you went all the way down in the ground. It's so much cooler down there, it's not going to work in the same way. Eventually those roots will form and everything, and you'll get a big plant. But when you put it that horizontal way, like I said, it's close to the warmth, close to any water or liquid fertilizer you'd put on, and they just go nuts that way. So that was a great one. But I learn from people that I meet gardening every day. You learn something from them. For me, I really encourage people. I love to hear their stories about how they were brought into the world of gardening and what. We're in daffodil season here right now, and so we talk a lot about daffodils, and so many people have these memories of daffodils, that harken back to people that they know or people that they knew. And that's the part of gardening and interacting with these people that I love the most, is hearing about how they're moved by these plants and how these plants bring back so many memories.
Well, Doug, we greatly appreciate the time you've offered to Holly and myself and all of our listeners and the knowledge you shared with us. How can our listeners find out more about you and the books that you have written?
Everything's at DougOster.com. It's very easy to find, and I answer garden questions all day long. I consider that my job. So if you have a question, you just hit that contact button. And if you don't get an answer, that means I didn't see it. Don't be afraid to send that contact or that email again, because I love that part of it. I love doing that. I love trying to help people in any way I can. And like we all do, we all learn from these people, too, when they contact us.
Absolutely.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. It was so much fun to talk to you guys again. And I love the Instagram feed.
Thank you.
For more information, please visit thewisconsinvegetablegardener.com.